Us again this morning. She was here a little while back, and we appreciate her coming back. And she is from the Harvest Vineyard Church in Ames, Iowa. So, I guess so.
Awesome. Is this okay? Good, we're on. All right. Feel free to adjust so if it sounds too tin canny. All right, good to be with you again. It's been, I think I was here like maybe 6 weeks ago. I can't even remember. 6 weeks ago. And I was so encouraged, and I feel like God has really great things for your church. And just being here and being with you and getting to know a few of your leaders, you have a great thing going here. And I am really excited for what God is going to continue to do. And as you guys transition into a new season, it's really exciting. So if you're ever in Iowa, like driving up I-35, we're right off the interstate. We'd love to see you and have you stop in sometime. So like they said, I am Cory Miller. My husband is what's called the area pastor for Iowa. So Scott was the area pastor. If you remember, I mentioned this. The old pastor here was the area pastor for this like kind of greater Nebraska, some kind of, I don't even know what he all oversaw. But we got to know them through that process, and so we are sad still that we don't get to see them at some different meetings, but I'm excited for what's next for your church and for their family. So hopefully we won't be strangers now that we're all in the same area, like the same region together. Like we'll see some of you at conferences. If you ever make it to like a Midwest conference or something, Josh and I are always there. Would love to have a conversation with you or see how things are going at that time. So we are going to be talking today out of John chapter 14. So if you brought a Bible, you can go ahead and turn to John chapter 14. If you didn't bring a Bible, or if it's not, you don't have a phone that has the Bible on it, I'll be reading it out loud as well. So in John chapter 14, Jesus starts out with this right here. He says, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God and trust also in me." We're going to be reading all the way through verse 6 on here, but that's kind of where we're going to start. And in John 14:1, this little verse contains like the greatest mental health advice that any of us could ever receive, which is, do not let things throw you. Trust God. Trust also in me, he says. Is there anything more common to our emotional life as humans than the experience of troubled hearts? All right? I mean, that is something that we all experience. We know there are forces in this world that are entirely outside of our control, and it's just easy to have a troubled heart. Are any of you here today sitting with a troubled heart? Are you feeling overwhelmed with a situation you can't fix, a storm that you can't stop, a relationship you can't mend, money you need but you don't have, regrets over the past that you wish you could change? Are you troubled about your health or the health of someone that you love? And as we look at chapter 14 today in the book of John, unfortunately, there's this chapter break at the end of 13. And so actually at our church, we've been preaching through the whole book of John. But at the end of chapter 13, Jesus has just announced to his best friends, his 12 disciples, that he is going to be leaving them. Pretty much he's telling them he's going to die. And there's this unfortunate break because do you know that chapter like 13, 14, 15, and like the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4 that are the actual verses numbers, those were added in like the year 1200. So they weren't like the inspired biblical authors were thinking this would be a great place for a chapter break. It's not. This is one of the unfortunate places because Jesus is like continuing. It's like the same thought. He's in the conversation with his guys and he says things are about to happen. Things are about to get ugly in life. In fact, I'm about to die, and then all of you are going to die. Okay, you're going to live these horrible, die these horrible, torturous deaths. And then he says, but don't be troubled, okay? Don't be troubled. Don't worry about that. So he tells his followers that my leaving is going to be so traumatic, so fear-inspiring that even you, my closest disciples, will deny me. It says back in chapter 13 at the end, then Jesus answered, like in verse 38, Will you really lay down your life for me? Very truly, I tell you, before the rooster crows, you're going to disown me 3 times, he tells Peter. He says, all of you, you're going to turn your back on me. You're going to act like you don't even know me. But don't let your heart be troubled, okay? So after these announcements, he says right away in John 14:1, don't let your heart be troubled. Don't let your heart be unsettled. He's talking about death. And we know, every human heart instinctively knows that death is monstrous. right? We know that. That it's radically traumatic, that it's alien, it's the ultimate enemy, it's the last enemy. That's why when Jesus came to defeat death, it blew everything out of the water. So there's this emotional storm that the disciples were in when Jesus says, don't let your hearts be troubled. And I think that many of us can relate to that today. There's many of us that are sitting here even maybe today that have troubled hearts. So let's read all of chapter 14, verses 1 through 6, and then we'll unpack it just a bit here this morning. Okay, I'm going to start again with number 1, verse 1. Do not let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God, trust also in me. My Father's house has plenty of room. If that were not so, would I have told you that I'm going there to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you may also be where I am. You know the way to the place where I am going. And Thomas said to him, Lord, we don't know where you're going, so how can we know the way? And Jesus answered, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. I am the way and the truth and the life. So he says this incredible counsel, Jesus does, for giving us peace in this troubled life. He knows our most base common affliction as humans, which is a troubled heart. And what's his counsel? First of all, Jesus shocks us with this command. He says, do not let your hearts be troubled. I have a daughter who's in 3rd grade, and she's learning, in grammar studies, you learn a declarative sentence, which would be I have a troubled heart. And then you'd learn an interrogative sentence, an interrogating sentence, which has a question mark, do you have a troubled heart? But here he says, this is in the imperative, do not let your hearts be troubled. I mean, he gives you this command he gives us here. Don't freak out. He doesn't say here, don't have any troubles. Don't let yourself have any troubles. But he says, don't let your hearts be troubled. Jesus doesn't command us to fix our circumstances or have total control over everything that happens to us or our loved ones. But he does tell us that as followers of Christ, we can choose our responses to the situations that life tosses at us. Now, American culture communicates to us a lot of times that we really don't have any choice in how we're going to feel in circumstances, right? Maybe it was the way that you were raised, the home you grew up in, what happened to you when you were 11, your health, your finances, your genetics, your spouse. Culture says, of course, you should be troubled. You have to be troubled. Look at all these things that are stacked against you. But here's the good news for us today as followers of Christ. In Christ, we don't have to respond the way we've always responded. Right? Isn't that good news? So let's say you're someone that's habitually given to worry or fear or discouragement. You can be set free from living with that troubled heart. Now, this isn't some simplistic, positive thinking don't worry, be happy. That's not what Jesus is saying here. Don't let it get to you. That's not what he's saying. He is saying that you don't have to live in a troubled state, that internal churn that many of us sit and resonate in, for marinate for long periods of time. So then you're probably asking me, well, Cory, that's really great, but how? How do I not get wrapped into fear and despair and a troubled heart? Well, Jesus says here that the cure for the troubled heart is the believing heart. He says, trust also in me. He's a believing heart. Let me connect this for you. In our culture, many people do not think that what you believe about things really matters. Now, it really matters in American culture how you feel, right? Don't hurt anyone's feelings, right? And I'm all about, trying to bless and encourage people, but we're really, as a culture, don't hurt anyone's feelings. Don't challenge another person's feelings. But on the other hand, beliefs. For most Americans, beliefs don't affect us that much. And in fact, we have a pluralistic culture. And one of the worst things that we can do as Americans is believe something really strongly. Because then people get afraid of strong believers. They think you might become a fanatic. When you believe something with all your guts and you're wholehearted about it, people are like, I don't know. Maybe you've experienced that before in your workplace or even in your family. You're gearing up for Christmas going, Aunt Ethel, she thinks I'm off my rocker, So Jesus looks at life completely different than that. He says that beliefs are all important, and what you believe totally affects the way that you live. What you believe is actually the foundation of what you feel. If someone was to follow me around for a week or a day or even a month, and they watched everything that I did, publicly, privately, they would probably get a pretty good idea about what I believe about life, right? They would. So if you're someone, or if you know somebody that they think, well, you know what, it doesn't really matter what you do. No one cares. No one's watching. If you believe you're not really responsible to please anyone other than yourself, then you'll likely spend your days and nights in self-indulgent, like self-pleasing behaviors, right? On the other hand, if you believe that there's a God who speaks the truth about life and in reality, he loves you, he absolutely wants what's best for you, that there's this God who's going to hold us accountable for our actions, and also we believe that, you know what, life works out the best in the context of trying to please God and not always myself, right? Life works out the best that way. It is in my best interest. I will have the best life if I focus on loving God and loving other people, and I deny myself of my immediate pleasures, right? I mean, that makes sense. I'm going to reject in my life the things that God says is wrong, because I'm going to have a better life if I do that. It works out best for me if I embrace what God says is right. And beliefs, they take on a special importance when we're in crisis, don't they? When we have a troubled heart. It's especially crucial to examine what you believe when your heart is troubled. What are you believing about God and about the future? And what do you really believe? And no matter how well your life is going right now, maybe you're on like the cloud nine kind of state of life where you're like, you know what, everything, like all of my T's are crossed and my like I's are dotted in life right now, and things are really going well. The reality is that none of us are immune and the storm will come, right? My ship is eventually going to get dashed across the rocks. Like something will happen that shakes me a bit and my heart will become troubled. And what I love is that the reason that we believe things and the basis for like this stable life is believing what's true. And Christianity, some people like have these objections to Christianity. They're like, oh, you know, you're not really thinking. You're just believing that. You're not really thinking it out. But the reality is that Christianity is a thinking man's religion. Like it really is like, you got to think this thing out. Jesus says there's truth here. And any time that you're troubled, listen to it, think about it, reason it out. Do you believe that Jesus Christ was God, that he died for your sins, that on the cross he defeated death, that he rose triumphant over the grave, that he passed into the heavens, and then right now, like in this passage, he says, I am going to prepare a place for you, that you can also be where I am. Like I'm getting things ready for you. That's awesome. That's really freeing. And if you believe that, then there's comfort. And if you don't believe that, or if you have friends and family that you know that don't believe that, and you know that they live in the thickness of a troubled heart, they're stuck. They're trapped in this life. So no wonder they have to maximize it and get it for all it's worth, right? Because this life is all they're living for. That's all there is. If something destroys your health, or your wealth, or your happiness, your battleship has sunk. That's all that there is. And throughout the Gospel of John, Jesus claims to be a bringer of truth. We see in John 14:6, like we just read here. He says, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. We believe something because it's true. Jesus is saying, everyone on the side of truth listens to me. And then back in verses 2 and 3, he says, in my Father's house has plenty of room. And like in some versions of the Bible, it says there are many mansions. Have you heard of that? Like there's many mansions. Like many people are going to be around. Like lots of rooms, lots of mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you that I'm going there to prepare a place for you. He says, I'm going to come back and take you to be with me, that you may also be where I am. So we see here that Jesus says, I'm going to prepare a proper place for you, a place. Like I mentioned before, Jesus knows that each of his disciples, they are going to die and suffer this incredible, horrible death. In fact, outside of Judas, who betrays him, like with a kiss just like in the next, like a little bit in the story here, every one of them, except for one who dies a lonely exile on an island, he knows that they are going to be sawn in half, his disciples. He knows this. He's talking to them. They're going to be sawn in half. They're going to be impaled on stakes. While they're still alive, they're going to be covered with pitch and lit on fire. This is what happens to these 11 people that Jesus has as his best friends. They get tied to wild animals and pulled apart as the animals get set off in two directions and their limbs get pulled out. And he says, I want to comfort you. Now, let's be real here. If this is what he gives them, this better be some pretty good stuff. right? If this works for them, it's got to work for us, because there is nothing, I'm not going to be tied up to two wild dogs, like going in two different directions anytime soon. And how do we know that this actually worked? Well, it goes on, like if you study church history, these men, and then the early church, if you've studied them, I mean, they go to their deaths rejoicing, singing hymns, counting it like glory to be able to suffer for the cause of Christ. Like it worked, right? They were really comforted. They found it worthy to suffer for his name. So here's the ticket for today. When you feel vulnerable or worried, out of your mind, or regretful or fearful, believe that Jesus is preparing a future for you that is wonderful, and that he is coming back a second time to take you to be with him where he is. It's awesome. Here in 2 verses is the Christian's answer to the troubled heart. This is good news, my friends, this morning. The hope of heaven and Jesus' promise to take us there. He says that if your heart is troubled in this world, focus your attention on heaven. Think about heaven, cultivate your appetite for heaven, spend time processing heaven, read about heaven. There's a great book, if I can just plug a resource, called Heaven by Randy Alcorn. It is awesome. Awesome. Just fills your mind with, as best as he biblically can figure that heaven would be like. What will it be like? Now you might say, but you know what, Cory, that is really great, but that doesn't really help me that much now. My troubles are now. And when I think about what's interesting about the American church is that there's this almost total absence of the discussion of heaven, study of heaven, focus on heaven. And if you read the words of Jesus in the Gospels, he spoke about heaven and hell more than anybody else. He believes in them. My mom, she lived in Europe for a time, and I got to go visit her a few times and travel there a bit. And there's a ton of old cathedrals there, and I would visit them a lot because they were free. And I liked free, and I didn't have to pay to go in. So I go into these old cathedrals, and if you go into these places that have been around for a long time, what do you see? Art on the ceiling and covering the walls and the statues is pictures of heaven and the angels and the saints and all. They give you this real forward-thinking picture. Or the agony and destruction of hell. You see people in their kind of distorted figures, and that stuff is all over until just in recent history. It's in a lot of historical paintings and sculptures and readings by Christians, our old creeds. Maybe you've heard of the Apostles' Creed. I grew up in a church that said the Apostles' Creed all the time. And one of the things that they say there is that Jesus Christ will come again to judge the living and the dead. And then it proclaims the resurrection of the body and life everlasting. And we said that. We said that every week. I believe in that. Does that sound familiar to anybody else? I don't know if anyone else grew up saying that. But in the U.S., most of the time, the only time we talk about heaven is at a funeral, because that's comforting. There's almost this embarrassed silence about heaven and the second coming of Christ other times. We never think about or hear that it's the ultimate cure for our troubled hearts, ever. We never hear that. It's the promise of heaven that helps us live better now. And why is that? Well, Peter Kraft, he's a Catholic professor of philosophy in Boston College, he said, we've lost the hope of heaven because we've lost the love of heaven. Lost the love of heaven. So let me repeat that. We've lost the hope of heaven because we've lost the love of heaven. And I think Peter Kraft is dead right. Almost no Christian that I know loves heaven. They don't really think about heaven. I'm one of them. Heaven is it's not something that I really process that often. Except maybe my elderly grandmother, because she's a believer and is about to go to heaven. So she spends a lot of time thinking about it, and eagerly anticipating seeing her husband. And that brings great joy and comfort. But I don't know a lot of 25-year-olds or 35-year-olds that are I can't wait to get to heaven, So why have we fallen out of love with heaven? And I'm going to share with you just a few reasons, and here's the first one. We believe, the church, we believe that heaven is impractical. We want something for living well right now. We want a resource for living well right now. How can I get out of debt right now? How can I be a better parent right now? How can I live more in unity with my spouse right now? And I get that. Those are all good things to study and learn from. But we want something practical. And somebody out here, you might be thinking, well, this might comfort me on my deathbed, but what about practical doctrine right now? And Jesus is talking about heaven and hell more than anyone. And he has an amazingly practical way that he always teaches. Jesus was so practical, that's why people would follow him around no matter where he went, because he had really good things for helping them live better, like on the earth too, right? So Jesus was totally practical. And he says it's entirely practical to think about heaven and hell. And Jesus understood that our experience of life now is almost entirely determined by what we believe about the future. Okay? We make different decisions now based on what we believe then. Make sense? Very practical. It's important to think about where we're headed. What road are we on? My view of the future will affect the state of my heart now. That's what Jesus is saying. So think about, my parents right now, my dad's a missionary in Africa, like temporarily, and he's in Africa right now, and my mom is there joining him, and there's this place, there's a little island, it's called Zanzibar, and in the island of Zanzibar it kind of was like a launching pad for like slavery. So people were like ripped out of their homes in these various towns in Africa, and then they had to like do these horrible marches, like for excruciating number of miles, and they eventually got to this Zanzibar. And I went there in college as well, this place where my parents are at, and there are the auction blocks. They're the places where they would like slaughter the babies because they didn't travel well, and then the places where you could, if you were a strapping young man, you got more for your head than if you were like an older woman, so they're the places where you stood, okay, and you were auctioned off to the highest bidder. So you think about if you're them and you're about to get on a boat. Okay, so if we think about them, when they're thinking about where they're headed, there was no joy in what was going. They're going to America, the land of enslavery, of destruction, of ripping away families, Now, let's say you were an immigrant 100 or 200 years ago. You're coming over from Europe. You're on the boat, and it could have been the most wild ride of your whole life. Because you're like, I'm going to America, the land of opportunity. The streets, they heard that the streets were paved with gold, So same type of boat, same type of journey, all determined by where they were headed. What life was going to be like, totally determined what kind of songs they sang on that ship, right? Think about that. Very practical to think about our view of the future and how that affects the state of how we live right now. In everything, your view of the future determines your present experience. So, think about this for your marriage. If things are really tough right now, but you're like, well, we just had a baby, or I had a job change, or my spouse had a job change, or I'm finishing up some school. Things are just a little bit thicker and tighter on our schedule, but it's going to pass. It's a temporary thing. We can get through this. You think about it differently. It's like a different kind of hope to get through your present marital struggles. But if you're like, you know what? My marriage is lifeless, joyless, and when I look at the future, I have no hope at all. I feel like my marriage is this life sentence. It's like a prison that I'm in. I have no vision for the future. Then there's no joy right now. Hard to live well and enjoy being married now with that kind of view of your future. So thinking on heaven is quite practical. And unless we understand the bigger world and that our world is part of a much bigger world, like this world is like a small piece of a bigger world, then we don't have the power to face our troubles in life. And it changes the decisions that we make. So that's why I think that it's awesome when I've been thinking when I was prepping this message, so what in the end matters, right? Loving God, loving people. I feel like God was saying, Cory, love people, put your money into people, put your time into people, meet the needs of people, comfort them, transform them, bring them to Jesus, because they're what's going to last, right? So knowing that heaven influences now, then I put my time, money, energy, resources into different things. Troubled hearts are practically changed by a view of the future. Okay, second objection to heaven as a cure for our troubled heart is that we believe heaven is what's called escapist. That might be kind of a word that might be newer to you. I'm just going to unpack it for 1 second. Here's what I mean by that. There was an old philosopher, his name was Karl Marx, and he said heaven was the opiate for the masses. It's like what you do to escape because you don't want to deal with reality. Okay? You're thinking about heaven because you don't want to deal with your stuff now. But heaven is escapist only if it's a lie. Only if it's a lie. It's realistic to think about heaven if heaven is real. Don't believe in heaven because it's a nice thought. Believe in heaven because it's true. Heaven is real. Heaven awaits us. And I love, in the Vineyard, we say, and we get to experience a bit of heaven now because the kingdom of God is breaking in at any moment, right now. So we get a little bit of the future right now. It's awesome. So it's kind of like, I have 5 kids. Like, when pregnancy, like with your womb, it's kind of like this life, this earth is like a womb for eternity. Okay? So all of the bumps and squeezes, all the rattling around that happens, we're being formed and birthed for eternity. Like this is kind of like a holding growing pen for eternity. Okay? Either in heaven, we're going to be with God and the lovers of God, or we'll be in hell and it'll feel like you're all by yourself. There'll be other folks there, but you'll be all alone. Like that's what heaven is. Like absence of God and community and love, you know. But I think the reason heaven is so neglected, here's actually the biggest one. Heaven is so neglected in our thinking. Why we Christians don't think about it is because Christians think, well, heaven is actually quite boring. I think heaven's going to be boring. A lot of people think that. Heaven will not be boring. It's not going to be like this eternally long, unending church service. Because church can be boring. I mean, let's just be honest. At times, it can get a little boring. Singing can get a little boring, especially if you don't really like to sing. So if you're like, oh my word, I have to spend like thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years singing Blessed Be Your Name, like I am not there. I don't want that, I don't want to sing for eternity. Some people that's not their thing. But God is not boring and will not be boring in heaven, and you will be with God. In heaven, we'll have perfect justice. Our hearts are often troubled because life in this world is so unfair. My mother-in-law, Diane, is here to join me today. And she, even just on the car ride over here, we came yesterday, she's talking about these awful stories. Like one of our towns, like small little town in Iowa called Marshalltown, there was a gal, like on her way, she sees this couple on the side of the road. They need some help with a flat tire. She pulls off to help them, and they just beat her up. I'm like, what's up with that? Like this is Marshalltown, Iowa, small town. But there's going to be great justice in heaven. The innocent will no longer be trampled on. And heaven will have perfect forgiveness. And what is one thing that gives us troubled hearts that keep us up at night? Thinking about past mistakes, things we did or didn't do, should have or should not have done back yesterday or the day before or 6 years ago. It's remembering choices we made that we can't redo. And we'll no longer remember. I just can't wait to not remember the way that I've hurt people. Aren't you thankful for that? There's going to be a time that we don't have to think about that anymore. We're not going to remember what we did or didn't do. That's awesome. And in heaven, there'll be this perfect homecoming. We just had a guy in our church that just came back from Afghanistan. On that homecoming, you see him on the news, or maybe you've seen him on movies before, where the men get to American soil and they fall down and kiss the ground, and their wives run to them in their pretty dresses, and the kids jump on their necks. Perfect homecoming. Don't you want that? Eternity, getting to know people that love you, that care about you, that welcome you. Jesus says that he's preparing a home for us. I'm going to close with this. So a house is different than a home, right? It's more than geography. A home is a place where you belong, where you're totally accepted. Home is a place where you can be yourself, where there's there's the front door is open. There's a fire that's lit. It's warm and cozy. Supper's ready. You walk in. The smell of the foods you love the most, they're ready on the table. And then someone that you love guides you over to your favorite chair and you put your feet up. It's that feeling of homeness, like you're done wandering, like the day is done and you can sit and relax and breathe deep. No more restlessness. There's a concreteness about heaven, about this place we'll call home. When Jesus had his resurrection body, he comes to his apostles. What does he do? I don't know if you remember this, but he comes into the room and he eats a fish. He comes in and eats. So he doesn't have to. In our glorified bodies, we're not going to have to eat Twinkies and meat. We don't need that. Unfortunately, we can't. We probably won't. They no longer make Twinkies. I don't know if there'll be Twinkies in heaven. But there's a place where you eat where you love, you laugh, you learn. There's a concreteness about it. The Father's house contains the new heavens, the new earth. And what will that be like? And I think about, in this, Josh and I, we took what we called like the Great American Road Trip. This summer we took our kids out on this big trip. Like we went out to the west and then like made a big loop and came back. And if you've ever been out west, you know this. Like the canyons and the valleys and the waterfalls and the peaks of the mountains and all this beauty. If this is the kind of world that God gives to people who, are his enemies, that we start off as his enemies until we're drawn into him. If this is the kind of world that he will give to the people that beat up the woman on the side of the road who stops to help them change a tire, what more will he give to the people that are his friends? What kind of world will this be? It's awesome. In that land, in that house, a blade of grass is going to be so real, so glorious, so sharp, so clear. I really believe we're going to bow down and worship just to see a blade of grass in heaven. The Bible says that the beauty of heaven then is going to pass to you. Like we're going to have the beauty of heaven. We're going to get clothed in that. We're going to become glorified people, glorified selves. Daniel 12:3, back in the Old Testament, says, "We'll shine like stars and like the sun." Now, it's hard for me to wrap my mind around this, but it's kind of like, instead of having our 5 senses, it's like we're going to have 1,000 senses or 10,000 senses. Like we're going to be so alive, so aware. In the old days when you're fighting a battle and you needed to defend your city from the invader, fortresses would have these things called watchtowers. I brought a little example. If you were with me last time, you know I like props. So I have here this. It's like a watchtower. Okay, so let's say you're in the midst of battle. Your city is under siege. What did they do? They'd climb up the watchtower. They'd take a look, see if there are reinforcements coming. They got a bigger picture of life, right? Like our city is not alone. There's some other armies coming to help us out. We can hunker down for a little bit longer because help is on the way. There is something bigger. We're a part of something bigger. And so when you go up into the watchtower of your life, this is what I believe. If you go into the watchtower of your life, you have to look and see the bigger picture. You see that reinforcements are coming for you, that this life is not all there is. There's a bigger hope, a bigger vision. That's the image that we have in the Bible, is that when we're down here fighting in this world of terrible injustice and sin and evil that ransacks us and the people that we love, and when our hearts are troubled and we're overwhelmed, we go up into the watchtower and we see the bigger picture. We get up, we climb up, we take a bigger picture. We see, but heaven awaits. Good things are coming. All will be well. All shall be well. Right? Getting a glimpse of heaven is what we get when we climb up the watchtower. So, if your heart is troubled right now, I would love for you this week to take some time. You and God, get up in the watchtower. Take a look. Think about what's coming. Get some hope for you. And that leads us to this next question. Here's the last thing. So how do we get to heaven? Look at verse 4 again. Right here. It says, "You know the way to the place where I'm going." And Thomas said to him, "Well, Lord, we don't know where you're going. So how can we know the way?" And Jesus answered, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." So what is the road to heaven? Jesus says that he is the road. And in fact, there is no other road. And this isn't religious intolerance. It's just the truth. Okay? This is Jesus speaking truth to us. Jesus is the only way to get us there. And trusting in him is the only way to cure our troubled hearts. So let me close with this. This world is not all that there is. Death is not going to have the final word. It's like this. If you've ever seen a homeless person or met a homeless person, a park is a great place to visit, but a lousy place to live. Right? There's beauty and there's goodness in the park, but it's a lousy place to live. And if the park that we're living in is our money, our health, our relationships, that's not home. Okay? Those are good things, but that's not where we camp. We have to say, Lord, all these wonderful things I love on earth, if I make them my home, if I make them what gives me joy, I will be lost forever. I'll always be wandering and never come home. It's like the book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Have you read that? Or maybe your kids have read that? It's like in there, it's always December and never Christmas. Aren't you glad, like, because we're in December, that it's not just always December, but Christmas is coming, right? Jesus is coming. The Messiah is coming. He's coming again to take us home. He's the one who satisfies us, who prepares a place for us. And he says, let not your heart be troubled. So let's go ahead and stand. We're going to pray. Well, Father, today we just confess that we are weak people that are prone to troubled hearts, God. And we focus so often on the here and now and the present and our circumstances. And we forget, God, that you have gone before us. May you give us hope. You've not left us alone, God. And may you prepare a way for us. God, thank you for that. Say, blessed be your name, God, the name above all other names that saves us. Would you help us, God, get up into the watchtower of our lives, God, to see a bigger picture, to have hope, practical hope, to live well today with peace, and to not have restless minds when we lay down at night. God, that we could live different and victorious because you live in us. We don't have to be like everybody else. You're reminding us, God, we don't have to do what everyone else is doing and be like everybody else. God, you've sent your Spirit. You've made a way for us. And you prepare a home for us. So God, I just pray right now by the power of your Spirit that you would begin to deeply satisfy our hearts. That you bring peace that passes understanding to each person here that might be restless. And if there's anyone here, God, who hasn't experienced, God, that you are the way and the truth and the life, I pray, God,